Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, let's jump right in. When we look at today's geopolitical landscape, it is so easy to assume the global stage is just this ruthless, zero-sum battleground, right? But what if it doesn't have to be? What if there's actually a meticulously engineered blueprint for global stability? Is permanent world peace a realistic goal, or is it just a hopelessly naive dream? Today, we are unpacking one of the absolute heavyweights of global politics, liberalism in international relations.
Seriously, this single question, is permanent peace achievable, is the ultimate dividing line in political science. Realists will tell you that war is just a tragic, inescapable feature of human nature. But for liberals, ending war isn't some utopian fantasy. It's a totally attainable goal. And the stakes here? They're absolutely massive. We aren't just talking about dusty academic theories. These ideas literally dictate how modern governments draft treaties, build global alliances, and run their foreign policy every single day. Liberals basically argue that if we use the right tools, like international institutions, deep economic ties, and democratic norms, we can literally engineer a much more peaceful and cooperative world.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to cover 1. Defining liberal IR theory. 2. The core assumptions. 3. The many faces of liberalism. 4. Liberalism in action. 5. Modern challenges. And finally, 6. Liberalism versus realism.
All right, Section 1, defining liberal IR theory. And hey, just to be crystal clear right out of the gate, this framework has absolutely nothing to do with everyday domestic left-wing or right-wing culture wars.
Liberalism in international relations is actually highly specific. The whole thing kicks off with this profound moral claim. The individual, not the state, is the fundamental building block of a just global system. Because of that, the absolute biggest threat to your individual liberty is the concentration of unaccountable violent power. So for liberals, the main job of global politics is to build binding institutions and deep-rooted norms that actively restrain that violent state power.
Scholar Jeffrey W. Meiser actually hit the nail on the head here. He notes that the theory contains a variety of concepts and arguments about how institutions, behaviors, and economic connections actively contain and mitigate the violent power of states. You see, unlike other theories that treat states like giant, impenetrable billiard balls just constantly crashing into each other on a table, liberalism widens the lens. It brings individuals, multinational corporations, non-state actors, and international organizations into the mix. Basically, it runs on the incredibly optimistic belief that cooperation is genuinely possible and that tomorrow can absolutely be tangibly better than yesterday.
Moving on to Section 2, the core assumptions. Let's look at the worldview that actually drives all of this.
Now, this intellectual framework definitely wasn't built overnight. It took centuries of intense philosophical heavy lifting to get here. Let's trace that evolution real quick. Back in 1795, philosopher Immanuel Kant argued in his essay Perpetual Peace that a federation of democratic states would create lasting peace. Why? Well, because everyday citizens, the ones actually paying the brutal costs and shedding blood in war, would demand it. Fast forward to 1918, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson tried to literally build this with the League of Nations, aiming for a massive collective security organization. Now, the League obviously failed to stop World War II, but the liberal project itself didn't die. It came back swinging in the 1940s with the robust architecture of the Bretton Woods system and the United Nations. And by the 1980s, scholars like Robert Keohane modernized the theory into what we call neoliberal institutionalism. Keohane proves something really cool. Even if states are entirely selfish and self-interested, institutions can still change their math and force cooperation to happen.
Here is the real kicker about how liberals view the global stage. They actually totally agree with realists that the international system is anarchic. There's no global 911 you can call, right? No overarching world government enforcing the law. But instead of seeing this as a permanent war zone, think of the world more like a lawless frontier town. In this town, international organizations like the UN or the World Trade Organization act as a newly formed town council. Now, they aren't a heavily armed police force that can just arrest you, but they do provide a crucial forum. They change the daily calculus, giving states rational, powerful reasons to talk things out and cooperate rather than instantly reaching for their weapons.
Okay, to really grasp this difference, we have to talk about absolute versus relative gains. Picture global wealth and security as a giant pie. Realists are downright obsessed with relative gains. They're constantly looking over their shoulder to see if their slice of pie is bigger than their neighbor's. If an economic agreement helps both sides but helps their neighbor just a tiny bit more, the realist completely rejects it. They're terrified the neighbor will use that extra wealth to build a bigger army. But liberals, they focus on absolute gains. They honestly do not care if the slices are perfectly equal, just as long as the entire pie is getting bigger, and everyone is measurably better off than they were yesterday. For a liberal, institutions are essentially the essential bakeries that build the trust required to bake that larger pie.
All right, Section 3, the many faces of liberalism. Because this theory is definitely not a single monolith.
Depending on which lever of society you pull, liberalism offers a totally different mechanism for achieving peace. Take commercial liberalism, for instance. Rooted in Adam Smith's classical economics, it argues that deep free trade makes war economically irrational. I mean, you don't bomb your best customer or your main supplier, right? Then there's Republican liberalism, which says a state's internal domestic political structure is what actually dictates its foreign policy behavior. Or consider cosmopolitan liberalism, which claims our true moral community isn't our nation, but all of humanity. That's the specific strand driving the whole modern push for universal human rights. Each of these variations gives us a distinct, unique tool to try and stop global conflict.
It's actually super fascinating to watch how these ideas evolved over time between different eras. Early on, classical liberalism was laser-focused on the natural rights of individuals. It championed limited government as the primary mechanism for peace. But as the world rapidly modernized and industrialized into the early 20th century, we see this pivot to idealism, often called Wilsonian liberalism. This was a massive shift toward incredibly ambitious, top-down collective projects. So instead of just emphasizing philosophical rights, they started attempting massive institutional engineering, pushing for open diplomacy and global collective security pacts.
Next up, Section 4, Liberalism in Action. Let's see how this actually plays out in the real world to prevent wars.
We absolutely have to talk about democratic peace theory. This is, without a doubt, liberalism's most empirically rock-solid contribution to the entire field of political science. The data is practically indisputable. Statistically speaking, full democracies just do not fight major wars against one another. Now sure, they will absolutely fight non-democracies, but against each other? The peace holds. And why is that? Well, it comes down to deep institutional restraints. Democratic leaders have to get legislative approval and public backing. And let's face it, everyday citizens generally don't want to die or pay massive taxes for some frivolous war. Plus, democracies mutually recognize each other as legitimate and law-abiding. Since they rely on compromise at home, they naturally share this powerful norm of peaceful conflict resolution abroad.
Let's look at a concrete historical case study to see these mechanisms in action. American restraint back in 1914. At the time, the U.S. had invaded Veracruz, Mexico over a diplomatic dispute. Now, there was immense pressure in Washington, both military and political, to just go all in, escalate, and occupy the entire country. But President Wilson exercised restraint. And why did he hold back? It certainly wasn't because the U.S. lacked the military firepower. It was a potent combination of huge public opposition, Wilson's own anti-imperialist values, a genuine fear of severe international backlash, the rising global norm of self-determination, and the U.S. government's own institutional separation of powers. It's a perfect example of how ideas, norms, and domestic institutions symbiotically restrained raw state power right at the absolute height of the imperial era.
Which brings us to Section 5, Modern Challenges. Let's impartially stress test this theory against some hard geopolitical reality.
So, commercial liberalism confidently tells us that deep economic integration prevents war, right? Well, when we look at the reality of the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war, we see a massive, brutal conflict erupting even though Europe and Russia were deeply fundamentally interdependent economically, especially when it came to energy. We also see this intense geopolitical rivalry boiling between the US and China, clashing over advanced tech, Taiwan, and influence in the South China Sea despite their absolutely massive, intertwined trade ties. Add in the frequent paralysis of the UN Security Council, a noticeably weakened World Trade Organization, and a surging global wave of populism and democratic backsliding, and the picture looks pretty stark. To put it objectively, the liberal world order is currently facing some of the most severe, high-stakes stress tests in its entire history.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 6, Liberalism versus Realism, the ultimate heavyweight clash. When you strip it down to their foundational views on human nature, these two theories are just night and day. What's crazy is that both sides actually agree that the international system is anarchic, but from that exact same shared premise, they draw wildly different conclusions. Realists assume states are inherently power-seeking, suspicious, and conflictual because the anarchic system forces them to be. But liberals, they look at that exact same lawless system and assume states can be highly cooperative, and the genuine tangible progress is totally possible over time.
Don't get me wrong, liberals aren't naive. They know military power exists, and bad actors roam the world stage. But they flat out refuse to accept that humanity is doomed to endlessly repeat the bloody tragedies of the past.
This foundational divergence dictates exactly how they view the tools of global politics. Like when you watch the UN Security Council on the news, a realist basically just sees a convenient tool of statecraft. To them, great powers use these institutions when they're beneficial, and they toss them completely aside the second they restrict their national interests. But for liberals, mutual economic dependence and international institutions literally rewrite how states behave. They see these bodies as genuine binding constraints that effectively foster transparency, build critical trust, and make long-term peace heavily incentivized.
I want to leave you with this one final thought, because I think it perfectly captures the absolute core tension in global politics today. Realists will always ask, but what happens when a state gains enough power to just break the rules? And liberals will confidently reply, that is exactly why we need institutions, to raise the costs of rule-breaking beyond what even the most powerful states are willing to pay. So, as you look at the rapidly shifting power dynamics happening in our world right now, what do you think? Are our global institutions strong enough to keep the cost of breaking the rules too high? Or are we reverting to a world where might simply makes right? Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next Explainer.